You were deceived in the very first history lesson, when it was quietly and confidently explained to the first generations of schoolchildren. The 19th century is about carts, steam engines, soot, exhausted workers, and the first clumsy steps towards an industrial miracle. They were shown pictures of dirty people with shovels erecting great structures that even today, with modern cranes and computer calculations, can barely be replicated. They had a simple idea hammered into their heads. Everything used to be primitive, but we are progress now. But there is one problem. As soon as the school textbook is removed and cold logic turns on instead of a beautiful fairy tale, this picture begins to fall apart. It is enough to ask one direct question. Where did so much metal, technology, and labor come from in the 19th century if we are simultaneously told about poverty, disease, wars, and the initial level of industry? In old photographs from the end of the 19th century, we don't see pathetic sheds and crooked houses. We see giant bridges, railway stations with huge glass vaults, complex frame buildings, and those 2 points that run out of any logic, the Crystal Palace in London and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. They tell us with a serious face, all this was designed on paper by candlelight, and then manually assembled by almost illiterate workers in record time. Without computing equipment, without precision machines, without a developed system of standards, the official version sounds smooth until you start testing it with simple questions. Not complicated formulas, not secret archives, but ordinary arithmetic. How much metal does it take to build a crystal palace? How much ore needs to be mined? How much fuel needs to be burned? How many people have to work at furnaces for years just for one exhibition toy? Why did the production statistics of that time say that the whole country had to abandon rails, weapons, and machine tools if it really cast such monstrous amounts of metal? And this is just the beginning. Logistics, which they prefer to keep quiet about, is even more absurd. We are told about weak railways, about horse carts as the main transport. But then how were thousands of tons of metal supposed to get to the center of a huge city, along dirty roads and fragile rails? Why aren't the chronicles of those years littered with descriptions of endless traffic jams, collapsed bridges, and a completely paralyzed London? Instead, we have something else in front of us. A palace that seemed to materialize on its own. And now, something that is usually not even discussed. Take a look at the quality of the parts, the elegance and precision of the casting. No rough beams, everything is adjusted to the smallest detail. The parts are assembled as an ideal construction kit. Nowadays, software-controlled machines, lasers, and electronic controls are used for such precision. The official picture of the 19th century does not have all this. But there is a version that thousands of workers at different factories manually created the elements, which then, without a single mistake, converged millimeter to millimeter. There is a fork in the road that makes many people uneasy. Or in the 19th century, there were technologies that they simply decided not to inform us about, carefully cutting them out of textbooks. Or the Crystal Palace and similar structures are not at all a brainchild of the Victorian era, in the usual sense. They could not be built from scratch, but found, dug up, restored, and presented as a new miracle of progress. This version seems crazy until you remember how one of the main prides of the 19th century ended. The iron and glass building, which official history had elevated to a pedestal, burned down. It burned down completely, as if it were made of dry planks rather than metal and glass. To destroy such a colossus, you need a temperature comparable to an industrial furnace. But they just tell us, fire accident tragedy. The smooth wording and neat dates hide a much more unpleasant thought. The story we've been taught since first grade may not just be inaccurate, but deliberately twisted. The technological wonders of the 19th century look too complex, too large-scale, and too thoughtful for a world where carts were supposedly the main means of transportation, and mass literacy was just beginning. And the more closely you look at these symbols of progress, the clearer it becomes. Someone tried very hard to ensure that we never asked the obvious question: what if this is not the legacy of our civilization? Now let's take a closer look at the most striking symbol of the miracle of the 19th century: the Crystal Palace in London. The official story confidently tells the huge glass and iron pavilion was put up in a few months, as if it were not a giant structure, but a temporary greenhouse near a garden plot. The area is tens of thousands of square meters. The length is more than half a kilometer, and the height is like that of a decent modern building. All this was allegedly invented and implemented by a gardener who had previously been involved in greenhouses. A gardener, not a major engineer, not a genius of metallurgy. The strangeness begins as soon as it comes to materials. The frame took thousands of tons of cast iron and hundreds of thousands of handmade glass sheets. To obtain such a quantity of high-quality metal in the middle of the 19th century, tens of thousands of tons of ore had to be processed, and mountains of fuel burned. Where are the traces of this race? Where are the giant quarries? Where are the melting furnaces of incredible power? Where are the slag heaps the size of hills? If you believe the dry figures, the entire metallurgy industry of the country had to forget about rails, weapons, and cars for a while, and work only for one pavilion. But there are no real signs of such a national feat around. Then it gets even more interesting. Let's say that by some miracle, this metal was cast after all. The next question arises: how was all this delivered? The official picture: weak railways, the main freight transport, carts with horses. This meant that thousands of wagons loaded with heavy beams had to crawl along the sodden roads to London for months. This is a logistical nightmare that was supposed to paralyze the capital. Clogged entrances to the city, collapsed bridges, and constant accidents. But the newspapers of that time were silent. No descriptions of the transport hell, no complaints about the metal invasion. It feels like the palace just appeared, without long lines of carts, without destroyed infrastructure, without traces of a giant delivery operation. The quality of the frame itself finally knocks the ground out from under the feet of the official version. Inside the palace, there are not rough beams, but neat, repetitive elements, elegant, artistic casting, details that seem to come out of one perfect conveyor belt. We are told, this is the middle of the 19th century. Standardization is just beginning. Each plant has its own standards, its own templates. But in fact, the parts made at different enterprises converged during assembly with millimeter accuracy, without software-controlled machines, without laser testing, with manual labor and different patterns. It does not look like a real construction site of that time, but like the assembly of a ready-made designer created in one powerful and very sophisticated production. Now fast forward to Paris, to another miracle of progress that is known all over the world. Eiffel Tower, postcard, fridge magnet, background for tourist photos. We've been told for years that it was built in a little over 2 years, especially for the exhibition, as a temporary structure. A beautiful symbol, the iron arch of the holiday of technology. But as soon as you start to take this story step by step, the tower ceases to be just a romantic decoration and turns into a mute accuser of the official version. Let's start with the numbers translated into common sense. Thousands of tons of metal structures were used on the tower, and not any metal, but high-quality iron. Officially, it refers to puddling iron, a material that is produced with the hardest manual labor, stirring molten cast iron with crowbars in a furnace to burn off excess carbon. Imagine not the romantic silhouette of the tower at sunset, but a hellish picture. Huge furnaces, endlessly burning fire, and crowds of people who stir red-hot metal day and night, batch after batch. With this method, it is impossible to achieve the same composition and strength of each portion. One melt is slightly weaker, the other is slightly stronger. But the tower has been standing for more than a century. It has been experiencing winds and temperature fluctuations and continues to hold the load as if it were made of a perfectly calculated material. Next is a construction kit made of tens of thousands of parts. Official figures indicate about 18,000 metal elements and millions of rivets. Each rivet had to be heated, inserted into the hole, and riveted before cooling. This is work at height, in the wind, at risk to life, in conditions where any inaccuracy leads to the fact that the details simply do not fit together. We are told that all the rivet holes were drilled in advance in the factory and simply assembled on the site. This means that the engineers had to calculate in advance the position of each point, each hole, each joint, with an accuracy of fractions of a millimeter, without electronic calculations, without three-dimensional modeling, with paper drawings and slide rules. With such a volume of manual labor, the percentage of defects must be monstrous. Where is there at least one major scandal that a batch of parts did not fit, that the holes had to be reconfigured, that entire blocks were thrown away due to errors? Instead, we have smooth, delicate lines, details that seem to have grown out of each other. The tower is so harmonious in terms of load calculation and aerodynamics that modern experts still note its stability and design literacy. It turns out to be a strange paradox. The same textbooks talk about the primitive level of technology, and at the same time show an object that even today would be a challenge for the largest corporations. When you look at the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower, a simple question arises. Who built all this? Where did the crowds of workers, engineers, and craftsmen come from if old photographs of 19th century cities show a completely different picture? The pictures show wide avenues, huge squares, majestic buildings, and a frightening emptiness. There were no human flows, no crowds of workers, no crowded streets that textbooks like to decorate with. This is explained to us by the long shutter speed of old cameras, they say. Moving people simply disappeared from the frame. But if the exposure is in minutes, at least ghostly shadows, blurred silhouettes, and traces of movement should remain in the picture. Instead, there is a dead pavement and a stone ghost town. There is a version that makes you feel cold. The 19th century might not have been a time of rapid growth, but a period of recovery after a huge catastrophe. A global flood, a mud flow, the very clay flood that alternative researchers are whispering about. there were few people left, and there were a catastrophic shortage of adults and trained specialists. Against this background, the phenomena of orphan trains in the United States and the fashion for child labor in the mines and chimneys of Europe look particularly strange. Millions of street children suddenly appear in statistics and chronicles, but where all these orphans come from is silence. Where did their parents disappear to? Where are the entire generations of adults who supposedly built metallurgical giants and cyclopean structures? As a result, only photographs and postcards remain of the real ancient architecture, and the buildings themselves are either destroyed or rebuilt beyond recognition to a new style. The Chicago exhibition of the late 19th century, with its white city, electricity, moving walkways, and subsequent strange fires, looks in this light not as a celebration of progress, but as a carefully planned sweep. But the most disturbing thing begins when we look down into the ground. Modern builders, digging into the foundations of buildings that are shown to us as typical buildings of the 19th century, again and again find full-fledged floors that go deep down, with windows, doors, cornices, as if it were an ordinary ground floor, which someone just took and filled up to the second level. 3 or 4 meters of cultural layer in a little over 100 years is not dust from shoes or garbage. These are the traces of a powerful mud flow when the cities were covered with clay and mud, so that the lower levels simply went underground. Then it becomes clearer why some train stations and pavilions look as if they were pulled out of the ground. The tops of the metal frames protruded from the frozen layer. They were cleared, the rest was completed, glass was inserted, and declared the pride of the new era. In this light, the familiar picture of the past changes places. People in top hats and carrying canes no longer look like the creators of all this iron splendor. Rather, they are tenants of other people's buildings who arrived on the surface in time. Instead of an honest story about how civilization rose from the ruins of an older and more powerful world, we are shown pictures of a victorious industrial breakthrough. We live among decorations that we have taken for our work, and we use technologies whose true principle has long been forgotten or hidden behind convenient myths. And every time another old pavilion quietly goes under demolition or burns down in another accidental fire, another piece of someone else's erased reality disappears from history.